November 7, 1980, Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, 3:15 a.m. In a small clinic across the border from El Paso, Steve McQueen, the king of cool, the actor who defined masculine rebellion for a generation, died from cardiac arrest following surgery for mesothelioma. He was 50 years old, but 12 hours before his death, he handed a sealed envelope to his wife Barbara with instructions that it not be opened for 5 years. "This is the truth they won't want you to know," he whispered, his voice ravaged by illness. "Hollywood didn't just make me sick. They knew they were making me sick. And they didn't care." The letter, finally opened in 1985 and partially revealed in Barbara McQueen's 2006 memoir, contained Steve's account of how decades of film production exposed him to asbestos that caused his fatal cancer, and how studio executives, insurance companies, and producers deliberately covered up the dangers to protect profits. This wasn't accidental exposure. According to Steve's letter, it was negligent homicide on an industrial scale, affecting not just stars like him, but hundreds of crew members whose names nobody remembers. This is not the story of a motorcycle-loving rebel who lived too hard and died too young. This is the story of a man who was systematically poisoned by an industry that valued production schedules over human lives, and who spent his final months trying to expose the truth before it was too late. This is Steve McQueen's final testimony about how Hollywood kills. To understand Steve McQueen's rage in that final letter, you must first understand the boy from nowhere who became the coolest man in the world. Born Terrence Stephen McQueen on March 24, 1930 in Beech Grove, Indiana, Steve had a childhood so brutal it seemed designed to destroy him. His father abandoned the family when Steve was a baby. His mother was an alcoholic who could barely care for him. By age 9, he was living in a reform school. By his teens, he was running with street gangs, stealing cars, heading toward prison or death. The Merchant Marines saved him, giving him structure and purpose. Then the Marines gave him discipline. And finally, acting gave him an identity. He studied at the Actors Studio in New York, learning the method alongside James Dean and Paul Newman. But while they came from middle-class backgrounds, Steve brought genuine street toughness to his roles. He didn't have to pretend to be dangerous. He was dangerous, and Hollywood loved him for it. By 1963, with the success of The Great Escape, Steve McQueen became a superstar. He was the anti-hero America craved, cool, rebellious, masculine, in a way that felt authentic rather than manufactured. Films like Bullet, The Thomas Crown Affair, and Papillon cemented his status as the biggest box office draw of the 1970s. At his peak, he was earning over $12 million per film, astronomical money for that era. But the work was brutal. Steve insisted on doing his own stunts, pushing himself physically in ways that seemed heroic to audiences, but were actually incredibly dangerous. He raced motorcycles at high speeds for The Great Escape. He drove through San Francisco at breakneck pace for Bullet. He performed fire stunts for The Towering Inferno. The studios loved it because it saved them money on stunt coordinators and insurance. Steve loved it because it proved he was tough, fearless, the real deal. What nobody was telling Steve, or any of the actors and crew, was that the sets themselves were killing them. Slowly, invisibly, with materials that would take decades to manifest their deadly effects. Stop here. What comes next changes everything. The poisoning begins. 1963 to 1978. According to Steve's letter and subsequent investigations by journalists and medical researchers, his exposure to asbestos began as early as 1963 during the filming of The Great Escape. The film's famous motorcycle chase scenes were shot in Germany, but interior scenes and certain action sequences were filmed on soundstages in Hollywood that had been constructed with asbestos-containing materials, ceiling tiles, insulation, fireproofing compounds. Asbestos was everywhere in Hollywood during the 1950s through 1970s. Studios used it because it was cheap, fire-resistant, and effective for soundproofing. But by the early 1960s, medical research had already established that asbestos exposure caused mesothelioma and other deadly cancers. The studios knew. The insurance companies knew. But production kept using it because replacing the materials would have been expensive and time-consuming. They knew it was poison, Steve wrote in his letter. I found memos later, documents showing that studio safety officers had raised concerns about asbestos as early as 1962, but replacing it would have meant shutting down soundstages, renovating facilities, losing production time. So they calculated that it was cheaper to keep using it and deal with lawsuits later than to protect us while we were working. Steve's most significant exposure came during the filming of The Towering Inferno in 1974, the disaster epic about a skyscraper fire. The film required extensive use of fire-retardant materials and fireproofing equipment, much of it containing asbestos. Steve performed his own fire stunts, spending hours in enclosed spaces where asbestos particles were released into the air by the heat and flames. The protective gear he wore, including fire suits and breathing masks, also contained asbestos fibers. We breathed that stuff for months, Steve's letter continued. Every time they set off an explosion, every time we shot a fire scene, clouds of white dust would fill the set. The crew would joke about it, call it snow. Nobody told us it was asbestos. Nobody told us that every breath was a death sentence being carried out in slow motion. But perhaps the most damning revelation in Steve's letter involved what happened when crew members started getting sick. As early as 1975, according to documents Steve had collected, several crew members from the Towering Inferno production were diagnosed with respiratory illnesses. At least 2 were eventually diagnosed with mesothelioma. The studio's response wasn't to investigate the working conditions or warn other workers. It was to settle quietly with the sick workers, requiring them to sign non-disclosure agreements as part of their settlements. They paid people off and shut them up, Steve wrote. They knew the sets were poisonous. They knew people were dying from the exposure. But if they acknowledged it publicly, they'd have to change their entire production infrastructure. Every soundstage would need to be renovated. Every studio would face lawsuits. So instead, they paid off the dying and warned the rest of us to keep our mouths shut. This is where the official biographies quietly skip forward. The diagnosis and the discovery. December 1979. Steve McQueen was at the peak of his career when he began experiencing shortness of breath and persistent cough. At first, he blamed it on his heavy smoking and years of motorcycle racing. But when the symptoms worsened, he sought medical evaluation. In December 1979, he was diagnosed with pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer almost exclusively caused by asbestos exposure. The diagnosis devastated Steve, but what happened next enraged him. When his doctors at Cedars-Sinai began taking his occupational history to determine the source of exposure, studio representatives and insurance company lawyers suddenly appeared. According to Steve's letter, they offered him a settlement, millions of dollars in exchange for his silence about where and how he had been exposed to asbestos. They came to my hospital room, Steve wrote, suits with briefcases, offering me money to shut up. They said if I went public about the studio exposure, it would destroy the industry, cost thousands of jobs, bankrupt companies. They made it sound like my dying would be selfish if I took down Hollywood with me. Steve refused the settlement. Instead, he began his own investigation, hiring lawyers to subpoena studio documents and interviewing former crew members who had worked on his films. What he discovered was a systematic pattern of negligence and cover-up stretching back decades. Studios had known about asbestos dangers since the early 1960s, but had made calculated decisions that protecting workers was less cost-effective than dealing with occasional lawsuits and settlements. He found internal memos from 20th Century Fox discussing the acceptable risk of asbestos exposure. He found insurance company documents calculating the statistical probability of cancer claims versus the cost of remediation. He found non-disclosure agreements signed by dying crew members, each paid off to stay silent about the cause of their illness. I have the documents, Steve wrote in his letter. Names, dates, memos, where they literally discuss how many of us might die, and how much it would cost them. We weren't people to them. We were line items on a risk assessment spreadsheet. But the most shocking moment was still ahead. The silencing campaign. January-October 1980. When word got out that Steve McQueen was investigating studio asbestos exposure and collecting documents for a potential lawsuit, the industry mobilized to stop him. What happened next, documented in Steve's letter, and later confirmed by his attorneys, was a coordinated campaign to discredit his claims and isolate him from potential allies. First came the media strategy. Studio publicists began planting stories suggesting Steve's cancer was caused by his lifestyle, his smoking, his motorcycle racing, his years of hard living. The narrative was clear. Steve McQueen had lived recklessly and was now paying the price for his own choices. Asbestos exposure wasn't mentioned. The studios weren't mentioned. It was all framed as the inevitable consequence of a rebel lifestyle. They rewrote my story while I was still alive, Steve wrote bitterly. Made me into a cautionary tale about smoking and risk-taking. Never mind that dozens of non-smoking crew members were dying from the same cancer. Never mind the documents showing they knew the sets were poisonous. They controlled the media, so they controlled the narrative. Second came the legal intimidation. Studio attorneys sent letters to Steve's lawyers, warning that any lawsuit would face vigorous defense, and that Steve's own choices, smoking, stunt work, motorcycle racing, would be used to establish contributory negligence. The message was clear. Even if you win, we'll drag your name through the mud and blame you for your own death. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, came the isolation campaign. Steve's longtime friends in the industry, actors, directors, producers who had worked with him for years, suddenly became unavailable. Phone calls went unreturned. Planned visits were canceled. According to Barbara McQueen's account, Steve came to understand that his friends had been pressured by studios not to publicly support his claims because doing so might jeopardize their own careers. That hurt worse than the cancer, Steve wrote. Knowing that people I'd worked with, laughed with, trusted with my life on set, they abandoned me because Hollywood told them to. I wasn't dying alone. I was being erased while I was still alive. By mid-1980, Steve McQueen made the decision to seek alternative treatment in Mexico. Partly because conventional medicine had nothing more to offer him, but also because crossing the border gave him distance from the Hollywood machine that was trying to silence him. In Mexico, he continued documenting his case, writing his letter, and preparing materials he hoped would eventually expose the truth. And this is the part the studios never wanted revealed. The final testimony. November 6, 1980. Steve McQueen's final hours. He knew he was dying. The experimental treatments in Mexico had failed. The cancer had spread throughout his chest cavity. But he remained lucid enough to finalize his letter and give final instructions to Barbara. "Make sure this gets out," he told her, according to her memoir. "Not right away. They'll bury it if you release it while emotions are high. Wait 5 years. Let me be properly dead and mourned, then release it. Let people know that Hollywood kills its workers and covers it up. Let them know I didn't die from being cool or rebellious. I died from breathing poison they knew was poison." The letter itself, portions of which Barbara eventually shared with journalists and medical researchers, is a devastating document. It names specific studios, specific productions, specific executives who Steve believed bore responsibility for his death and the deaths of other workers. It includes references to documents Steve had collected, memos, safety reports, insurance calculations, that proved knowledge and negligence. But perhaps the most powerful section of the letter was Steve's plea on behalf of the crew members nobody would remember. "Everyone will mourn Steve McQueen. I was famous. I was loved. My death will be news. But what about the lighting guys? The set builders? The costume workers who spent years in those poisoned soundstages and are now dying in obscurity? Who mourns them? Who holds Hollywood accountable for them? If my death means anything, let it mean that those invisible workers finally get justice." Steve died on November 7, 1980, at 3:50 a.m., from cardiac arrest following surgery. The media coverage focused on his rebel life, his cool persona, his legacy as an actor. The asbestos exposure was barely mentioned. The studio documents he'd collected were sealed in pending litigation. The crew members who died alongside him remained unnamed and unmourned. The aftermath and the silence. When Barbara McQueen finally released portions of Steve's letter in the mid-1980s, the response from Hollywood was deafening silence. Studios issued brief statements expressing sympathy but denying any systematic knowledge of asbestos dangers during the relevant time periods. Insurance companies settled individual claims quietly while admitting no wrongdoing. No major investigation was launched. No industry-wide safety reforms were implemented. Several journalists attempted to follow up on Steve's claims, requesting access to the documents he had referenced. Most of those documents had been sealed as part of confidential legal settlements. The few that did emerge showed exactly what Steve had alleged. Studios had known about asbestos dangers and had made calculated decisions that remediation was more expensive than litigation. A study published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine in 1995 found elevated rates of mesothelioma among film and television workers who had worked on soundstages during the 1960s and 1970s. The study confirmed significant asbestos exposure in Hollywood production facilities. But by then, most of the affected workers were already dead or dying, and the statute of limitations had expired on most potential claims. The industry got away with it, said attorney Ronald Motley, who represented several mesothelioma victims in cases against studios in the 1980s. They knew they were exposing workers to deadly materials. They calculated it was cheaper to pay off victims quietly than to protect workers properly. And because most victims were crew members without fame or resources, nobody fought back hard enough to force real accountability. The story of Steve McQueen's death is not about a rebel who lived too hard. It's about an industry that systematically valued profit over human life, that knowingly exposed workers to deadly materials, and that used its power and resources to silence victims rather than accept responsibility. Steve McQueen had the fame and resources to fight back, to document the truth, to demand accountability. But even he couldn't overcome Hollywood's ability to control narratives and bury inconvenient truths. His final letter stands as testimony not just to his own death, but to the deaths of hundreds of unnamed workers who breathed the same poison on the same sets. It's a reminder that Hollywood's golden age was built on practices that killed the people who created it, and that the industry's response to that killing was cover-up, denial, and calculated indifference. "I'm not afraid of dying," Steve wrote in the final paragraph of his letter. "I've faced death before, on motorcycles, on film sets, in war. What I'm afraid of is dying without the truth being told. I'm afraid that Hollywood will bury me, and bury the truth with me. I'm afraid that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, other actors and crew members will be breathing the same poison because nobody held the industry accountable. If you're reading this, it means I'm dead. Don't let me have died for nothing. Make them answer for what they did. Make them change. Make them remember that we weren't just products on a set. We were human beings who deserved to be protected." Today, over 40 years after Steve McQueen's death, Hollywood has largely eliminated asbestos from production facilities. But that change came not from industry leadership or voluntary safety improvements. It came from government regulation and liability concerns. The studios never admitted wrongdoing. They never apologized to the families of workers who died. They simply moved on, calculating that time and silence would erase the inconvenient truth that they had knowingly poisoned their workers. Steve McQueen's letter remains a testament to that truth, a dying man's final act of rebellion against an industry that made him a king, but treated him as expendable. The King of Cool died fighting to expose the coldness of the system that created him. And in that fight, he proved that true courage isn't about motorcycle jumps or fire stunts. It's about speaking truth to power, even when you know the power will try to bury you along with your words.